Hello, everybody. Tim Hughes here. I'm the CEO and co-founder of DLA Ignite, and I've got Jim. It's Frawley, isn't it?
It
Jim?
is. Yes.
So I've got Jim with me today, and we're going to talk about communicating to the C-suite. It's something that we all have to do every now and again in our lives and in our careers, and certainly a skill set that I've had to learn over the years, but I can learn some more. Jim, where can people find you before we get into this?
Sure. I'm on all the major platforms, but my central location is bellwetherhub.com. I run an organization called Bellwether, and you can follow me, Bellwether Hub, on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, all of those. And Jim Frawley on LinkedIn probably has my most visibility.
Okay. And you're happy to take questions from the audience as we go through this? So
I love questions. Absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Yes.
Cool. So tell us a little bit about yourself in terms of, what's your journey to be able to start telling people and talking to people about communicating with the C-suite?
Sure. So I run an organization called Bellwether based in New York. We are primarily an executive coaching and change management firm. So we work with organizations on getting people prepared for the new economy. My background leading up to this and what got me into, we really specialize in three things: strategic planning, executive communications, and change management. And from an executive communications standpoint, I had a 15 to 20 year career in the corporate world, starting in radio, then got into training and development, then got into public relations and executive communications. And I really, from an executive communication standpoint, really earned my chops running executive communications for a financial firm in the middle of the financial crisis.
Because you were like in the eye of the storm of the financial crisis or something, weren't you?
The worst possible job at the worst possible time and the worst possible anything. But you learn so much when you reflect on it and you actually see who was successful, who wasn't, in terms of navigating your ability to communicate, because that was so important at that time. Those were the people that survived the down economy and were successful beyond that.
There's a saying, isn't there, about something about a sailor? Someone will tell me that a sailor on a calm sea doesn't a sailor make, or something like that. You've got to be on rough seas to really learn the whys and wherefores of certain jobs.
That's right, and part of it is because we learn from pain. And someone's going to tell you don't touch the stove, but you're still going to touch the stove. But once you get burned, you'll never make that mistake again, and you'll never, you're going to make different choices leading up to that.
So you've been used to actually talking with senior executives, and part of that job was actually having those conversations. So talk us about what should we do when we're having those sort of conversations. As I said, we all have to do it at some point in our career, whether it's going and asking for our boss for a rise or asking them to pay for some social selling training or something. We have to go and have those conversations.
Yeah. And I would say communications is the primary, most ignored or underappreciated skill set in industry in general. And the challenge we have is because most people don't really understand how communication works from a fundamental process model. We have to understand that there's a message being sent, there's a sender of information and a receiver. And if we break it down, how are you elevating your conversation to that senior level and taking yourself out of the micro thinking of my little world and doing the thinking for the senior executives on saying, this is where it fits into the overall strategy. This is where you need to be thinking. This is what I've done the thinking for you, and I need your decision on this. And this is what you need to know. How do we elevate the communication up to that point and then bring it back down to disseminate the information back to other people? And that gap is really misunderstood, because when we think about communicating, we say, I have something to say. But that's not what we should be thinking about from a communication standpoint. Is you need to understand this is something very different, and it's a very different way of trying to send a message, which is why Twitter doesn't work to really send messages. It's for quick little things, but there's no context. So yes. How do you communicate in a way and leave this nice little platform foundation for them to pick up what you're putting down and be able to run with it in such a short amount of time? Because the C-suite, they're going a mile a minute. They don't have time to stop, break things down, go into the details, and you have to do that thinking for them.
So you've put together a framework, haven't you, in terms of working out how to do this? Do you want to share that with us?
Yeah, most of my clients, when I'm trying to help them understand, I have a lot of people coming to me saying, I want to be in the C-suite. Get me to the C-suite.
Yeah.
And my first question to them is, you don't understand the C-suite at this point, and we have to talk about, there's 4 steps to being ready for the C-suite from a communication standpoint. And one is awareness. And that's the context that I just talked about. Let's get some awareness of what's going on macro from the organization. Where do you fit in? Let's take a look at the big picture, bring it down. But then beyond that, you have to properly prepare. You have to get ready in the moment to be learning in the meeting. And then you're going to take that as wisdom to influence the next time. So I go from awareness, preparation, learning, and wisdom. And that's really the arc of understanding communication at an extremely senior level to focus on proper preparation, proper context, and proper communication in general.
So walk us through those steps in detail. I mean, I remember one of the things that I learned as a salesperson. I happened to be on a course when I was on a graduate scheme where they taught me how to read a set of annual accounts, and it was a skill that I've always then used throughout my business. And it's one of those things where, I've been in lots of board meetings and said, it says in your annual accounts this. And the fact that you've actually quoted from the annual accounts was usually something where everyone went, wow, someone's actually taken the time to actually sit down, read our accounts. Whether they understood them, it doesn't really matter. But they've actually taken the time to prepare for this. And that was always like, at that point, you tended to get the "we respect you" type. And once you get the respect, anyway. So that's one of my learnings that I had around preparation. So what's your view?
Yeah, and the proper preparation, that's what you're ultimately looking for, is to gain that trust from the senior executives. You want to earn the trust. So proper preparation, I have people ask 3 questions before you go into a meeting. First question is, what do they need to know? And if you were going to be getting on an elevator with that senior executive, you could only tell them 3 things. What are those 3 things that you want to communicate to that person that they need to understand? And that's the crux of your information. And if you have more than 3 things, you need to bring it to a higher level so that they can understand, are you bringing this up to a senior enough viewpoint for them to say, okay, I understand what you're saying. So that's one. Beyond what they need to know, there's another aspect that you should, and this is the part of building trust, is what do you want them to know? And that's very different, because what they need to know is the basis of your communication. But what you want them to know is what's the message you're sending without words. And what's the message? You may want them to make a certain choice, but you're not really going to say that. So are you going to communicate things in a certain way? Or you may want to convince them that you're the right person to run this particular project, but you can't quite say it. So you're presenting information in a certain way. So that gives you the context in which you're going to be communicating to them in a certain way to say, these are the 3 things with this bubble around it, so that you could say, the primary purpose of this is to really say that I'm the best person for this project. So thinking through what you want them to know through body language, through other aspects of communication, and how do you want to influence them or influence a decision, that is part of your preparation as well. And then finally, number 3 is we have to think about what questions and objections they're going to have. Just like if you're going into a sales meeting, what objections are they going to have? Do the thinking for a senior executive. Because when we're sitting in the C-suite, there are so many things going on, they don't have time to think about your particular area. And when we're fully prepared and anticipate the questions and objections that they're going to have, we can give far more confident answers to get that trust that we had just talked about. If a C-suite person doesn't trust that you have it locked up, they're going to be asking you a lot more questions. And you do not want a person from the C-suite digging underneath your hood, asking all kinds of questions as to why you're doing things and all of this. So you don't want them picking. You don't want to stumble over your answers. To show that you've got this, you've done the thinking for them. And you say, yes, I knew you were going to say that, and this is my response. Yes, I know you have that question. I'm prepared with this chart right here to answer that and alleviate that fear. Shows that you're thinking about things at a senior enough level so that you can be that trusted partner, trusted advisor.
I think that's really good, and I think that's great counsel, because the thing about being a CEO myself, is I don't want people to bring me problems. I want people to bring me solutions. And that's part of the, you're not actually getting them to do the thinking because you've done the thinking for them. It's about them. You present them with a solution. You will always get somebody asking a question, because there'll always be one person there that will try and trip you up and try and go, and they'll do it for quite often for sport. And it's having that ability. I mean, I always tell people to practice your answers in the mirror. You've got to know it. It's really good counsel. Yeah.
Yeah, and you have sociopaths who just want to, they love to pick things apart, and when they smell blood, they're going to come right after you. But that's a great segue into, in the meeting, how do you properly respond in the meeting as an executive? How do you sit there and say, I'm supposed to be at this table? You're making the decision, but I'm the actual expert. So you can ask me all kinds of questions you want, but I'm going to be prepared for those, and I'm going to have all of the answers that you're actually going to need.
And I think sometimes when we appear on these things and go to these meetings, quite often we don't think the reason why we're there is we are the expert, and they're treating you as such. And we need to make sure that we're standing tall and we're ready to take all those questions, because otherwise they wouldn't have invited you in the first place.
Yeah, they don't have time for garbage, right? You're being brought to them for a reason, and you're being brought to them because you are an expert, and you're being brought to them because you're able to think for them and provide good counsel so that they can ultimately make the decision. So the boss is the decision maker. You are the expert to influence that decision in an appropriate way.
But it can be very nerve-wracking talking in those sort of meetings, which is why preparation is so important. So in a way, you need to think about every single aspect of the questions that you're going to get asked. I mean, there'll be always standard things that you're going to be asked, but you've got to go what is it that we've not thought about, questions that we're going to get asked. Right.
I mean, what are they not going to like about what I'm presenting? Or what is an alternative versus my suggestion? Or, and you know what, you've got peers, and ask them, and you could fully prepare depending on the scale of your meeting. I mean, if you're going in front of a board, that takes a lot more preparation than just, a random meeting with the COO about, you've got scale on these and different levels of preparation. But the pressure in the moment is something that you can work on as well, in terms of being open to this level. Confident people have vulnerability. Confident people recognize that humility is often misunderstood. Confident people are curious. And so you don't have to have all of the answers. That's okay. But you do have to have a conversation with them to fully understand where they're going. And in the moment, you can actually be very calm to recognize that you don't actually have to have all of the answers in front of you at that moment. You just have to have thought of some of those questions that they're going to have to build up that trust.
So when you're talking about being in the moment, I mean, quite often, I'm trying to remember the name of the famous negotiation book that I read recently. Always in negotiations, they reckon there should be two people, because if you're in a meeting, you can have one person talking and one person thinking. I've been in lots of meetings where you're talking, you hear a question and you don't actually listen to the question. You're just trying to think of the answer. And then the other person stops you and say, that's not what they asked. This is what the answer is. And so what do you think about that in terms of making sure that you've got this balance of listening and talking?
So I put the trio together in terms of learning in a meeting of vulnerability, humility, and curiosity. If you're by yourself, the way to figure out, the way to get beyond all of this is to not be prepared with answers, but to be prepared with really good questions.
Right.
And that is the curiosity mindset of, and sometimes it's not even a full question. It's just tell me more. And tell me more about what it is, and have the executive talk about, what objectively is not in this presentation that you'd like to see. And from that point, from a curiosity standpoint, then you go into the vulnerability of what can I learn from this executive to say, you know what, I will have that next time. Or, let me learn what exactly their motivations are so that we can have this conversation and I can think clearly. When I worked in radio, I use this example a lot. Many people, when you listen to the radio, you don't see what's happening in the studio. And all kinds of crazy stuff is happening in the studio, but all you hear is the person's voice. When you're presenting, nobody sees what's going on in your studio. They only see the voice and the person in front of them. So you're able to think, but think calmly and clearly. You don't have to rush your answer. Through questions, you can clarify it and recognize that, your humility, deferring to a senior executive, is not necessarily a good thing. You can have an idea. You can have a good question. Those are welcome things. When people talk about vulnerability in the workplace, they're not talking about sharing your problems over the weekends. They're talking about recognizing the fact that you don't have all of the answers. And if you don't, commit to getting it and have a follow-up. But if you do proper preparation and saying, you know what, that's not part of this, we can change the view, that's acceptable to 99% of the executives out there, because they want to challenge, and they want to challenge what it is that you're presenting. And you can have that conversation with them through curiosity, vulnerability, and recognizing that humility isn't the golden child that you thought it would be.
And I think that's so true, that quite often people go in there expecting to have all the answers. There's the old Mike Tyson quote, isn't it? That strategy works until you're punched in the face.
Right.
And then and when what happens is you're sideswiped. And then what you actually need to do is, and maybe you don't know the answer, but the worst thing you can do is try and make something up, because they will just see through it.
That's right. And if they start picking under that hood, because they know when you give them a line, it'll just take 2 to 3 questions where it just comes completely unraveled. And I've seen it happen, and it's so uncomfortable.
I mean, we have something here in the UK. You call it Shark Tank. We call it Dragon's Den, where you have people presenting and they start picking at something, and then they can see them all up, and then the whole thing just completely unravels, and you can see it taking place.
It's like a train wreck that you just can't look away, but you just feel, you feel so badly for them. But yeah.
So we've gone through the process of having we've prepared, we've done our presentation, we won whatever it was. What do we do after that?
Well, you have to recap. And when we talk about communicating to the C-suite, there's 2 modalities here I guess we could focus on. One is communicating the information, making sure they understand it. But 2, you want to present yourself in the best light, because they're the people who decide your fate later on in the future. So we want to learn after any presentation we do, what went well, what didn't, and do just that simple debrief. It's the same with going on a sales call, what went well, what didn't, doing a presentation, what went well, what didn't, running a project, doing anything. We have to take a look at, how did I communicate? Was there something I could have done better? Were there certain questions that I wasn't prepared for? How are you reviewing your ability to communicate? Because if you have a desire to get up at that particular level, that's a skill set that you're going to constantly have to build. And if you want to do a triathlon, you have to bike and you have to review, and you have to swim and you have to review. If you want to execute at the C-suite level, you have to communicate and review and constantly get into that cycle about learning mindset, continual improvement. And what are you doing to make sure that the next meeting is better than the one that you just had, no matter how good it is?
I think that's really good advice. I've walked out many a meeting, and then I always say to the person I'm with, so if you had to do that again, would you do any different in it? And they'd go, what was wrong? What was wrong? I said, no, I'm just trying to find out, if we want to do it, would we do it any differently? Because whatever you do, you have to do a review.
And we think that once the presentation's over, it's done, but it's not. And I'm telling you right now, 90% of people do absolutely zero recap work on how they did and how can I improve. Nobody does it. We all talk about we should do it, but nobody actually does it. And it takes 5 minutes to just walk out of the room, write down, and what are the 3 questions? What went well? What didn't? What would I do different next time? And that's it. And you can write that down and put it on your desk or whatever. And the next time you have to do a presentation, you pick it up and say, okay, I remember that. It is far and away, that is actually the first step to preparing for your next meeting, is the recap of the previous meeting before that.
That's great advice, Jim. Anything else as we're coming up to the 20 minutes? Any other advice you'd give us?
It's the only other thing that I deal with people trying to communicate at the C-suite level is that imposter syndrome of, am I supposed to be at that table? And we feel uncomfortable and we feel nervous. But the only thing I remind people is you wouldn't be at that table if you weren't supposed to be. So recognize that you are there because you are an expert in some particular way. And so constantly reminding yourself of the value that you're actually bringing is an important thing to remember as you're building that confidence to communicate to the C-suite and do all of those things. Is you're supposed to be at that table. So make sure you take advantage of it and do it right.
I think that's great. I think we've all suffered from imposter syndrome at some time in our careers. And you're right that we're there because we're the experts and they've invited us.
That's right. That's right. And it's nice to be an expert.
Well, it is. Yes. I remember being invited to a meeting with a very large bank at my previous corporate role, and no one could understand why it was me that was invited and not the account team. And the account team weren't very happy with it. And it was just because I had a presence on social media and they'd spotted me and they'd said, "We'd like you to come and present to the board." But the fact of the matter is that they'd found me. You're the expert, and you're therefore have a right to be there. And they're just as likely to see you as the cleverest person in the room, not the stupidest person in the room. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with being the stupidest person in the room because you probably learn the most.
And you can learn, and at least you're in the room. So that's
yes, good. Exactly. Yes.
Yep.
Jim, thank you so much for today. It's been really, really insightful in terms of getting over some really, some things that we all need to do and all need to learn into, because we all have to do those presentations from time to time. And I think that arc you talked about is really important. So thank you. Remind people where they can get hold of you.
I'm sorry?
Remind people where they can get hold of you.
Oh, yeah. So bellwetherhub.com, at Bellwether Hub on all your media, and Jim Frawley on LinkedIn. Come find me, say hello, and I'm always happy to chat.
Good. Thank you so much. And
thank you.
See you soon.
Yes. Perfect.
Thanks. Bye.